Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the webinar today. I'm really excited to join our two industry experts here, David Males, our Director of Business Development, and Valentina Lebedeva, our Solution Specialist. And they're really going to unravel the secrets of fostering resilience today. And most importantly, fostering resilience without starting over. This conversation emerged from David's blog post titled, An Agile Approach to Creating Shipbuilding Resiliency. And we're really going to be doing an in-depth look of that blog post today and expanding on some of the ideas that originated there. The goal will be to equip yourself with the knowledge and tools needed for a resilient shipbuilding process. And as a reminder, there's going to be a Q&A at the end. You can submit questions in the right pane, and we'll make sure to get to them. We'll be taking about 10 minutes for that, so feel free to have longer questions, more complicated ones, and we'll have a bit of a discussion around them. So all that being said, I'll hand it over to Dave to kick us off.
Great. Thanks a lot, Greg. So welcome, everybody. Glad you could join us today. Valentina and we're excited to share some insights with you that, we believe will help you build a more resilient and flexible shipyard. We've got 4 topics picked out for today's session. There's a lot more that we're going to cover in the future, but for today, we've got 4 picked out. So we're going to start today with a story. And this is a story. It's a refit of a naval vessel. And it comes to us from one of our own product owners, a fellow by the name of Joe Bryan. Joe's a naval architect and a marine engineer here at SSI, and one of many. And so, as I said, this story is about a refit of a naval vessel. And if it's all right with you, I'm going to read it. Joe did such a great job of sharing it with us that I think it's best that I read it to you. All right. So, during the refit of this naval vessel, this compartment had to be stripped down to bare metal, and the shipyard workers were in the process of putting it back together. So the outfitting lead put in a ticket to engineering support, said he needed us to provide a specification for putting some equipment back in the space. At first glance, that would mean, number 1, log into the database, find the right drawings and standards, and then write up the instructions. Sounds simple enough, doesn't it? However, doing a deep dive into the system of record for these particular vessels meant dealing with scanned paper drawings from way back in the 80s. So what we discovered, first, the drawing titles were abbreviated using seemingly random abbreviations. So even if you knew exactly what you were looking for, finding it could still take some hours, right? Second, it turned out that there was no complete elevation drawings of the compartment showing the equipment in place. And third, and I guess we've all heard this one, they were the design drawings, not the as-built or as-constructed, right? So it gets worse. When we showed the outfitting lead what we had found, he admitted, we had a further problem. He'd already tried to find the drawings without success, and now wasn't even sure if the equipment he was trying to put back belonged in the compartment, and he suspected it didn't. So between engineering and the yard, they eventually determined that the piece that was supposed to go back into the compartment was not the one they had in their possession. It had been lost somewhere. So naturally, that kicked off another wild goose chase, which eventually led them to the same compartment on it, you guessed it, a sister ship. Turns out that during the minor maintenance periods, when a ship had been damaged or had damaged equipment, instead of replacing or repairing it, it was considered fair game to take it off whatever vessel in the class wasn't in service at the time. It's like having a spare car in your driveway and you're just going to go take some parts. The move had probably been authorized at some point, but there was no digital trail of crumbs, for any of us to follow. So the engineers in that program, they all remember spending hours and hours in the database looking for drawings, trying to find all the different ways that someone could have abbreviated starboard. Remember, they're trying to get a view of it. Or they were squinting at photos from surveys of sister vessels, trying to get a decent view of the configuration of that compartment and hoping for a glimpse of the missing parts. So take all that together, and basically what you have is a very costly waste of time, an unnecessary risk, risk from errors in placement and potentially even the wrong equipment going back in there. So I think that's a great segue into our first topic, and Valentina is going to take us through that. And that's called poor information management. So over to you, Valentina.
Thank you, Dave. Yes, that's a very typical situation, and one of the biggest pitfalls that all companies, including shipbuilders, encounter is underdeveloped information management systems and strategies. And this story illustrated that very well. So during my years in engineering and working at SSI, I have observed a few very typical challenges causing poor information management. and I will name a few here. So the first one, very common, is siloed data and systems across departments. Many shipyards continue to use legacy systems which are outdated and may not be supported anymore. What also is very typical, they manage a project using spreadsheets and digitized copies of legacy drawings that are 40 years old, same as Dave mentioned in this story. That means that there is no single source of truth, no single point of access to up-to-date information for engineering, production, planning, or any other department. And another one I'd like to mention is the locked-in data, primarily because of using proprietary CAD formats and closed systems, meaning that data is not easily shared between applications. I would like to ask you, Dave, do you have any insights that shipbuilders could consider to tackle this problem?
Well, Valentina, I'm glad you asked. There's an awful lot to unpack here, both in terms of the story and some of the things that Valentina just shared with us. But broadly speaking, we're talking about the pitfalls that all point towards the need for a framework to capture that information. And today we call that the digital thread of shipbuilding. And for those of you who are familiar with that concept and have either begun your own journey, that really begins all the way from owners' requirements right through design, build, commissioning, operation, and then eventually into even decommissioning. But when we think about this framework, this digital thread, there's really three important areas to keep in mind. And those are the idea of interoperability across all enterprise applications. And by that, we mean not just the ones that are typical in our, in our engineering and our planning and our production, but supply chain, procurement. We need to have that interoperability across all those applications. The second most important thing to keep in mind is the idea that this framework should be tightly integrated with engineering. It's the source, it's where most data begins life, so that we can effectively track and manage that constant change that occurs during the design build. Most of us today know that as configuration or change management. If we think back to that story, we can see where the lack of configuration management and change management and overall information management strategy really made it difficult for those folks to find what they were looking for. The other piece that's really important, and this is something that we at SSI, really pride ourselves on, is this whole idea that, it's easy for systems to consume information from other systems. Everybody likes to get information. However, it's not always easy getting information out. So we need to have a framework that not only freely consumes information from our own internal systems as well as from outside, but also is able to distribute that back out. And again, both internally and to our external suppliers and partners. And I believe today most of us will understand that we see that digital thread, the foundation for that is PLM. We're seeing more and more shipyards implement PLM. Many, if not most of the class societies are using PLM for asset management. It's what it is, product lifecycle management. So there's a couple of things to think about in terms of your overall information management strategy. The next topic we're going to jump into is what we call, monolithic, or these legacy systems that have been around for a while. I think we can all agree that shipbuilding is complex and that no single solution or vendor can do it all. This idea of a belief in an all-in-one solution or a single vendor approach has been historically the way for some shipbuilders and even today. But there's some risks associated with that. And there's always going to be, at least in our opinion, the risk of being hindered by the fact that they're generally going to have an overall lower level of shipbuilding specific functionality. I mean, they're, generally generic tools, and we're going to get into that in the next subject. The approach that, we like to think about and what most shipbuilders are going to learn about, if not already, is this idea of a best fit approach. We'll cover that in our next topic. The other challenge is these closed legacy solutions that can't deliver the right data at the right time. And that's because they're typically not the single source of truth for manufacturing information that is needed by planning and production. And why is that? Number one, they don't integrate well with the entire organization. And two, the data is generally not with the model. But the other thing to think about here too is it adds unnecessary risk. This idea of having all your eggs in one basket. It's going to make it very difficult to, change strategies, to exit, or extract yourself from those complex contracts, but also the significant investment you've made into these, legacy systems. And so the last point I'll make before turning it over to Valentina is the idea of having access to industry-specific technology innovation. These monolithic legacy systems tend to be general in nature. And we all know that in our industry today, the rate of change in both technology and our industry is changing. And we as shipbuilders want to have access to that. So Valentina, how are some ways that shipbuilders can rethink their approach, and create a more resilient and flexible environment?
Well, from what I have seen, leading shipbuilders are shifting towards an integrated, layered approach where platforms and systems work together seamlessly, no matter what vendor they come from. So if you talk layers, as layer one, they typically implement foundational tools that deliver the core capabilities of a CAD or PLM system. And those capabilities are pretty much generic and not intended to address the specific shipbuilders' requirements. And therefore, as layer two, shipyards implement shipbuilding specific tools on top of the existing foundation, which provide the capabilities necessary to meet unique industry requirements and act as a central hub within the shipyard. And a shipyard can go even more granular. As a layer three, they can add specialized tools that address their unique business requirements. It can be many different things like cable management, structure analysis, CFD analysis, or many other highly specialized needs that are unique to their shipyard. So altogether, this layered approach removes the cost and risk associated with monolithic legacy systems. And because it is much more aligned with the shipyard's business processes. And I believe the most successful yards want to take advantage of ongoing technological innovation. For example, they choose vendors that with the clear product development roadmap for several years ahead, and certainly those whose product roadmap aligns with the platform approach. So in this way, the shipbuilders ensure that their vendors' technology will advance and match the industry and the business needs in the future, and that they simply stay competitive.
Very good. Thanks, Valentina. So we've talked about, poor information management. We've talked about some of these monolithic legacy systems. And in that, we made mention of this whole idea of, shipbuilding specific tools. So our next topic is going to dig into that, excuse me, a little bit more. And, let's call it general purpose tools. Today's commercial and naval ships, as are the owner's requirements, significantly more complex than they have in the past. And if you add to that the growing requirement, to deliver those ships digitally, and it's clear to me and it's clear to us that those challenges really cannot be met using, general purpose tools, right? So why is that? Well, simple, these general purpose or generic tools, they lack the shipbuilding specific DNA that we need. So think concepts, think workflows, and importantly, the data relationships between the model and every element within it. The other thing is these CAD models tend to be non-intelligent, so they lack the data needed downstream, for planning and production, because as we said earlier, the data in the CAD model are generally not connected together. So what does that mean to you? It means that in many cases, shipbuilders are left to develop and maintain this shipbuilding specific functionality for themselves. And then on top of that, they must apply their own shipyard specific requirements. We think about design for manufacturability. A lot of that has to do with the equipment we have down on the shop floor. So we have to keep that in mind. So over the long term, though, this presents a very unsustainable model, because of the constant changes arising and how ships are designed and built, changes in personnel. You think about the folks who are maintaining that code and the possibility that these customizations that we're making, make it impossible or at least difficult to stay current with the core software. So you're going to further risk, your data resiliency and your compatibility, right? So you ask yourself the question, are you a shipbuilder or are you a software developer? So with that, what should shipbuilders think about that will help them avoid or evolve away from this scenario, Valentina? What have you got to share?
Yes, unfortunately, a general purpose tool cannot offer a holistic solution to the unique yard challenges. I would consider incorporating shipbuilding specific tools that are fully configurable and move the burden of software development to the vendor if the shipyard wants to excel in handling complex shipbuilding programs and stay relevant, focus on their core business. And based on my hands-on experience as a design engineer and a CAD manager, I'd like to add that no tool will be efficient if the workflows between engineering, planning, production, and the overall operations of the enterprise are not efficient. I would suggest to do an audit of shipyards processes and combine good workflows and best practices with the right tools to automate the information flow and reduce shocks caused by the human factor in the shipyard ecosystem. And if you remember the story that you, David, started with, it was difficult to locate the starboard compartment drawing because the naming convention was unclear after decades in operation. So the intent of every process should be extremely clear and robust in the way that its effect on digital twin lasts even after years of operation.
Those are some good points, Valentina.
Thank you.
Why don't you take us to our next and last point before we get to our Q&A?
Yes, sure. There is one thing I would like to talk about. One thing that I have observed, and this is that in many shipyards, there is a perception that working with larger software vendors mean it's better, safer, it's more reliable, and it's quite a big misconception. As is often the case, bigger means shipbuilding is only one of many things that we do, and it's typically not the largest or the highest profile business for them. So what happens? The shipyard may find itself in a situation where their vendor is too big and unresponsive, so that they don't have sufficient or easy access to them, making it harder to get software problems resolved. They also can feel that they cannot influence the software development or even get something as simple as a timely reply to a price quotation. And another challenge working with larger vendors that I'd like to mention is that the overall cost of the ownership can be quite high, and for most shipyards today, it's not economically practical. We also talked about general purpose tools, and as most of the cases, or very often, those large vendors, they have what we call general purpose tools. And it's worth mentioning again that the rate of innovation within large vendors and their tool set may not meet the needs of today's modern shipbuilder because our industry is evolving so rapidly, our shipbuilding industry. And another concern that we hear is a lack of availability and access to a deep bench of industry-specific experience, solution experience, and strategic insight. And you and I have discussed it quite a lot, Dave. I'm pretty sure you have some thoughts concerning that. So why wouldn't you share it with us?
Great. Thanks, Valentina. I think this is a really good point to end with. You know, in the 35 years that I've been working, I've heard from countless clients how this, unresponsiveness from large multi-industry software vendors can really impact their business, both operationally and strategically. Even in my role here at SSI, I've talked to shipbuilders where that has been their experience. So the reality is that vendors will focus on their largest or most profitable industry segment. And if you're not part of that segment, there's a good chance that you're always going to come second. And so today, shipyards, they really need to and want to be recognized as innovative and progressive. And so how do they do that? So ask yourself this question: does my current vendor get me where I want to go when I need to get there? Do they have that deep knowledge of shipbuilding, and can I count on them when I need it? And we're not just talking technology innovation. While that's very important, as we talked about earlier, it's also that industry experience and that solutions expertise that your vendor, can bring to the table that really creates that resiliency. And why is that? Well, simply put, they speak the same language. They've been in the trenches, they know firsthand the challenges, and they know how to solve them. And they know this from direct experience. It's what they do. It's all they do every day. And so, the last thought we'll leave you is with, the benefits of working with a partner whose only focus is on the business of shipbuilding, are significant, and they will make a measurable impact to the resiliency of your business. So before we wrap up here, and we've covered some key points here, we talked about poor information management, we talked about legacy or monolithic systems, we talked about generalized tools, and then we talked about this notion of, working with large vendors, and when, shipbuilding is not their primary line. The one topic that we were hoping to get to, but we didn't find time, is, the idea of how software vendors like SSI manage their release cycles. How easy it is at upgrading. What's their implementation cycles if you're implementing a new tool. What's their data longevity. So all of those things are also critical factors in building resilience into your shipbuilding environment. We didn't have enough time to cover those here today, but we certainly do plan to cover those in a future blog. All right, so before we get to Q&A, and I see there's quite a few there, I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts around this whole idea of resiliency. If you think back to the story we shared at the beginning of the webinar about those individuals who are simply trying to get a piece of equipment swapped out, people are inventive and resilient, and, often far more so than the systems they work with. Well, because of this, they can deliver results, using poorly thought out systems and tools, but that's hard to sustain over time. Eventually, the system can and will burn people out. On that particular project, there was a lot of engineers and technicians that did not last very long at all, right? So those are some things we have to think about. We talk about people, we talk about technology, we talk about processes. People is one of the most important factors. So I'm going to leave you with one of my favorite quotes, and it's from an individual by the name of Simon Sinek. Many of you have heard of him. A company built for resilience is a company that is structured to last forever. And, I believe everyone on this call here today would like to believe that their shipyard, their company is going to be structured to last forever. All right, Greg, back to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dave. Thanks, Valentina. I know we could have covered twice as many topics if we had the amount of time today, but I'm ready to say that we've stimulated quite a conversation in the chat, and we've had a lot of questions come in. Just to wrap things up here, I'm going to post a link. It'll just appear below your screen to the blog post that kind of kicked all this off. Feel free to click that and save it as a read for later. Also, at the end of the webinar, you'll get some links to connect with Valentina and Dave on LinkedIn and access some more resources related to this topic. So once the webinar concludes, you'll see that pop up on your screen. But without further ado, I think I'll jump to some of the questions. A question from Bernadette actually kicked off a whole discussion in the chat, so I'd like your opinions on it, Dave and Valentina. So the question was, how do you change the silo-based culture in a shipyard? It's still very much present. And I'll give you some of the thoughts that some of the audience had. So Alan said, we've started to break down those silos here, and it takes buy-in from each group. They have to want to create a culture of collaboration. So I think it's interesting. We talk a lot about culture at SSI. So I don't know, Dave, do you have any thoughts on this?
Wow. Yeah, that in and of itself could spawn another whole webinar conversation. You're right. The hardest part of change is people, right? And we're all familiar with it, with the expression, oh, I don't mind change, just don't try and change me. In the years that I've been involved where, shipyards have undertaken these changes, and not even just shipyards, the single biggest factor towards success is the people factor. And I know I'm not telling you anything you don't already understand, but if I was to kind of nail it in a few things, it's obviously got to start from the top. We all understand that, change from the bottom up takes much longer than the top. one of the things I've seen personally myself is this whole idea of siloed data, siloed departments, is this notion of sharing information across those departments is somehow going to weaken. Some people approach this, well, knowledge is important and it gives me job security. But getting people to understand, what their role is in this, this overall change and how what they do contributes to that, and that sharing information really is going to work for everybody. It really just does boil down to managing the people side of change. So that's just one way to think about it. Valentina, if you've got something to add, please jump in.
Well, very quickly, those people who are involved in embracing the change, you should make them to own this process. And yes, they need to accept it. They need to kind of agree with that by the same. They don't want to feel it to be forced. So that's that's quite a big topic. I don't think we have so much time to discuss, but definitely that's one of the major ones why most of the implementations fail, unfortunately.
I'll add just one more piece to that before we jump to the next one. Implementing change that's going to go across the shipyard, it's huge. And the impact, of course, not only on the operations, but on the people is going to be equally large. There's this concept or notion that, institutional capacity for change, meaning how much change can an organization absorb at any one time. And so said in a different way, I don't know if you want to call this a tip or something like that. Change really needs to be done incrementally. In software development, we talk about the notion of agile. We do small little things and we iterate quickly. We pivot, we adjust, we adapt and change, right? And it's one of the concepts that, we talked about in the blog that this webinar was based on, is agile, the ability to change quickly as opposed to just following a plan and making that change small and agile. All right, what do we got next, Greg?
Yeah, a lot of questions and thoughts still coming in. This one's maybe a good one for Valentina. So Danielle asks, and because the word change keeps coming up, I think this is a great question. Why is it that most, if not all, yards really struggle with change management? It's touched on at the story at the beginning of the webinar. What is it that we just aren't getting? Valentina, any thoughts?
Oh, well, yeah, it goes back to this concept of siloed information. There is, if you have those scattered sources of information, that doesn't make it easy to track all the changes through all the different paths it could take, and it gets even worse when you have sister ships. So yeah, tracking, establishing systems and using systems for tracking the digital thread would be a great way to manage it better. Maybe starting with change management in itself, and then moving into configuration management, which adds a lot of complexity. And yeah, introducing those tools that actually automate workflows, capturing the information and sharing the information. So it's kind of you can find it very quickly. That's basically the aim. So you probably want to identify the workflows, what you have in your shipyard. You want to identify if anything needs updating in terms of those processes and workflows, and then apply the new technology helping you to automate those workflows. Hopefully that was an answer.
Yeah, I think it's actually a really good segue into a related question that Michael had. Valentina, you started talking about the digital thread, and Michael's question is more about the digital twin. So referencing the scenario Dave started with, the lost piece of equipment, can you outline how an ideal version of a digital twin might have assisted in saving time and money? For example, what would have been done at the digital level when the part was taken from another vessel. I don't know, Dave, do you have any thoughts on that?
Wow, yeah, digital twin, digital thread. The digital twin just happens to be a virtual representation of data that's within the digital thread. This whole idea of tracking assets across their life cycle, really that's what PLM is about. We all understand that. But the implementation of PLM, clearly crosses design, build, and then of course sustainment and operation. So to Mike's specific question, in a digital world, the movement of that equipment, that asset would all be part of a standard process. This notion of configuration managed, change management being one piece, but configuration management extends right through into, the operation, the sustainment phase of the vessel life cycle, so that not only does that piece of equipment relate back to the original requirements, so it's kind of that, content is one thing, but more importantly is the intent, right? So we can have a lot of content in our PLM, but equally important is the intent of that piece of equipment. Why is that piece of equipment there? Why was it chosen? That relates back to the requirements, that were defined by the ship's owner, and then tracking those all the way through. So if you had a system in place day one, to track those assets right through to sustainment and operation, and therefore in the repair phase, you would have known that, the equipment that was taken from the sister ship had been moved over to here. It's process. I think that might get to the heart of your question, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dave. I know we're already slightly over time here. We could spend another probably half an hour answering more questions and talking about these. So
I think we're gonna have to do a follow-up.
Yeah, sounds like it. I know we have a lot of topics to cover in the future, and thank you so much everyone for joining us today. Dave and Valentina, thanks so much for offering your insights. And yeah, like we're saying, we have a lot of inspiration for our next session. So stay tuned, everyone, and watch out for the next webinars in the future.
Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye for now.